All right, so you have built your base, your low relief base from the figure ground. And now what we're going to do is add some of these layers as three-dimensional objects that will basically sort of rest or sit upon your figure ground. So if you imagine at a very small scale, these are just sort of objects which maybe project or recess a little bit more. And later we're going to interpret them as sites and buildings, and by changing the scale and really kind of operating on them a little bit more. So what I'm going to want you to do is to cycle through your different sets of layers and take each of these sets of objects and stretch them up, extrude them, and place them in the relationship that they have to this low relief ground. So I'm going to suggest that the base layer is 0.5, that your figure layer from your figure ground be at 0.75, and that each of the other layers increase at an interval of 1/4 of an inch. So I've just extruded my tertiary layer to a 1-inch dimension, but let's just say I want to move these extruded objects. I drag over to select those objects. Now if I type in the command move, I can pick, because I have my object snaps on, I can actually pick this corner and move it right to this corner. And also if I know that that corner is at the 0, the origin point, I could actually just type in 0 and enter, or I could drag it from one point to another. So I've switched it to my Arctic view, and now I can really start to see that even with this one tertiary layer, that I am getting a lot of variation. I've got my ground, I've got my figure, and now I've got this taller tertiary level. Right now they look like several water towers or grain silos, and really they don't have that big of an impact in the composition. So one thing I may want to do is, picking them one by one, I may want to start to kind of move them and give them tighter relationships to the ground plane. We'll see. We're going to play with it a little bit. So, just for example, that's a little bit more realistic. It doesn't have quite as big of an impact, as the other figures that I'm going to want to emphasize. And it's interesting because this round figure really needs to be present at this higher level, but these other figures can push back toward the ground. Right now they are positive figures, so they're sitting up above the landscape, but I might choose later to use Boolean operations to take them out. So I really like this idea of making this more as a topographic map. Your topography is basically the surface description of your grade. So if we said, well, this is our ground plane, and we have these tiny ponds, let's call them little fish ponds or small gardens, that's a really kind of nice way to maybe use that tertiary level without giving it a form. We're actually sort of mapping it into the surface, which I like quite a lot. I think in my subsequent stages, I'm going to make that one of my modifications, where these are sort of depressions rather than forms. So another little tool or operation that I'd like to show you, I've just noticed when I turned on my secondary set of layers and I'm getting ready to extrude them. Now I'm wanting these kind of dimensions to be fairly precise, because in this instance I may later be wanting to have things at the 1/4 inch intervals, because I'm cutting models out of chipboard, which are 1/8 inch sheets, or I am routering with the CNC 3/4 pieces of thick plywood. And so I really kind of want them to be somewhat precise. But I noticed that I actually elevated this object in order for that to sort of show in the front of some other objects. So what if I want to kind of get things back together on the ground plane? I'm going to go ahead and move views, go to my right, and now you can see it's sort of hovering above the ground. But I have commands to align objects. So if I selected all of the objects that were kind of hovering above and I said align, I can choose to align their bottoms, their lefts, their rights, their tops. And I'm just going to say bottoms. I can click the button, or I can type the B, and then I can tell it where the bottom should be. Now everything has moved back into the same plane. So the next thing that I want to do, I keep bouncing back and forth between my views, and I really want to set up a view that I can go to consistently. So if I go under my drop-down menus in my viewing window, I can actually go to views and say show named view panels. And right now I have something set up as perspective 1, but if I click the plus, I can actually set up perspective 2. and hit apply. And now if I ever want to go back to this view, I can. So we've been using the extrude command, but there is a new feature in Rhino, which basically adds the extrusion functions into the gumball. If I select on an object and I get this little additional circle on my arrow, what that indicates is that this object is extrudable, which is great, because then if I just click on this object, I don't even have to type in the command. This is my tertiary, so that's going to be my 1.25 inch extrusion. I can hit extrude and it's done. Okay, that was fast. Let's do it again. It's going to default to the last thing I did. That's pretty fast. So I also noticed that I had left this little trace, and I want to show you one way to fix this. We now have the ability with the new commands to select sub-objects. So to do that, we are going to want to Command Shift click, and you'll see that instead of if I just click, I'm clicking on my whole object, but if I have Command Shift click, I can connect a sub-object. If I wanted to be really precise, which of course I do, use the Move command. That's the only intersection there, and move it up to this intersection. Let's go ahead and go back and extrude. They're all extrudable. I can tell now because my gumball says so. And I want these ones to be the 1.5 inch extrusion, so I'm going to go ahead and pick that. Now look what happened. Because I used the gumball extrusion, it didn't close my object off. It extruded it almost as kind of a surface just along the edges, but didn't cap it in either direction. The command to kind of finish and close these is cap. So if I type in cap, now you will see that the object has a top. I can move them using sort of my quick locations graphically, or I can type 1, 1. I love the three-dimensional extrusions, but I'm really missing the regulating lines. And one of the things that I think conceptually is a really nice idea in architecture is that the drawings are sort of the registration of a kind of history, a sort of thinking history, but maybe even also a kind of building history. And so I like to interpret the regulating lines for a potential that they might have to be demarcations or locations or even special features within a site. What I'm going to do is choose my regulating lines and actually extrude those too. So if I start with a point and extrude a point, I get a line. If I take a line and I extrude it, I get a plane. I'm just going to take the lines that really haven't had a registration yet into the site. So I'll make this 0.625. They're now these kind of little plate-like bars. I've selected the bars rather than the curves. Type move, click my origin point, and move it to my origin, which is 0. The site has some of these demarcations, which I think is a really nice addition. It really gives sort of a lot more interesting texture that we can begin to sort of interpret as information in the site. So I've cleared the field. I've selected all my objects, and now I'm just going to Alt and drag. So I'm going to want you to make modifications to each of these three that allow you to just play and experiment with these tools. Right now, all of our extrusions are uniform in their dimension, and one of the things that you may choose to do to give some variation to this and give some sort of spatial variety might be to scale part of the object. So when I typically click on the object, I get the whole thing. But again, if I Command Shift click, I'm just going to get a single part. I might Command Shift click to get that plane, or I might Command Shift click to get just the top. If I got the top, imagine what I can do. I could actually scale the top, and look at what happened to that object. It sort of stretched it into a kind of oblong conical form. Let's undo that. But remember, I can also hold my Shift key to scale in a uniform dimension. And now I've got this kind of uniform cone. Well, the other one that we talked about was using some of our Boolean operations. So I'm going to do one where I simply make these small indentations in the landscape instead of figural objects. So I'm wanting to use these cylinders to basically make some divots into the surface. So right now, if I was to use the Boolean difference command, they would cut all the way through the object. So I really want to raise them up. And I know that if the bottom is slightly below this surface, then I can kind of push into the surface. Right now that surface is at 0.5, so I want to move my objects up 1/8 of an inch less than 0.5. And you can do that also with the gumball. So if I click, instead of clicking on the green and dragging to graphically move the objects, I can click on the green once and I can actually type in the dimension that I want. So it can be positive or negative if I'm moving up or down. And I'm going to want to go in the positive direction, 0.325, just intersecting with my base object. I'm going to go ahead now and use the Boolean difference commands, pull out or subtract that little cylinder from my surface. The Boolean command did not want to Boolean several objects at the same time. So it's as simple as that. All right, there you have it. That's the assignment for the week. Please use your diagrams to generate a low relief and operate on the objects, make variations in their heights, use some of the select sub commands to isolate portions of each of your elements and modify them, scale them, shrink them, twist them, etc. And then I'd also like you to use the official Rhino user's manual and to look there for lots of other tools that you can use to modify your solids and have a good time with it. Reserve one copy that is a little bit more official for later use.